Hello and welcome to today's CoveTalk on the strategic logic of proxy warfare with Andy Maher. I'm Major Michael Armstrong from headquarters of 2nd Division here at Randwick Barracks, representing the Cove this afternoon. If you haven't yet downloaded the Cove app and turned notifications on, or followed the Cove on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn or ForceNet, then please consider doing that now, as that's the best way to stay in touch with what's going on at the Cove. This CoveTalk will discuss what proxy warfare is, the increasing frequency of irregular conflict, and the difficulties associated with analysing state and non-state relationships. There'll be a good deal of reference to the Russia-Ukraine war, in particular Ukraine's resistance operating concept, and the wide range of implications for international relations, warfare, strategy, and theatres of war. The central presentation will be delivered by Andy Maher, who is a University of New South Wales lecturer as the co-convenor on the Theory of Special Operations course with specific reference to guerrilla, revolutionary, insurgent and military threats and militia threats. He's a visiting fellow at UNSW Canberra and at Charles Sturt University in their terrorism studies programs. He's also worked with the Modern War Institute at the US Military Academy West Point and the US Joint Special Operations University. And finally, he's also a busy man, the Engagement Director for the Irregular Warfare Institute. If you have any questions during Andy's presentation, please SMS those questions through to 0428 222 399. That's 0428 222 399. And you'll see that number displayed on the screen throughout the presentation. So without further ado, Andy, welcome to the Cove.
Thanks, Mick. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here, and thank you also to the Cove and to Div for inviting me to speak with you today. As Michael so kindly introduced, there's a number of themes that I'm going to be addressing with you today. I'll speak for around about half an hour and then engage with those live and out there in the virtual world for any questions that you may have. The genesis of this project is that in recent years we've turned to the terminology of being in a grey zone of competition. But what does that mean? What does that look like? In fact, have we been here before? Are there things that we can learn from history in terms of informing our current policies regarding defence? And of course, the way in which Australian Armed Forces go about preparing for contemporary warfare. And so with that in mind, there's a number of key themes that have informed this presentation today. Major power competition is invariably constrained. During the Cold War, this was constrained due to the threat of mutually assured destruction. But today, it's also constrained by virtue of the sheer economic cost of conflict. Imagine, if you will, a wing of JSFs being knocked out of the sky, and the dollar value that's attached to such exquisite platforms. A second key issue is the long-term trend of an increasing proclivity toward irregular warfare. This creates a certain, combines with a certain democratisation of conflict. What I mean by that is a low barrier to entry. Effectively, that everyday people are empowered to be able to participate in conflict due to things such as the ubiquitous smartphone. These issues come together and interact in a way that, in my mind, creates a number of key outputs. First of those is proxy warfare that I'll talk about throughout the presentation. Second is how this is manifesting at present in the Ukraine. And third, how do we inform our approach with dealing with these dilemmas by virtue of a history of theory relating to insurgency and counterinsurgency? How do we develop new theory and new options based around this, this background? So when I use the term proxy warfare, there are two overlapping issues. Firstly, support relationships. Patron, a generally state-based actor, is offering a level of support, generally to an irregular actor, a non-state actor that is engaging in armed conflict. Where these two issues overlap is when we start to have a problem. So let me put that in tangible form for you. Russia has mobilised in 2014 and again in more recent years the Night Wolves outlaw motorcycle gang. The close relationships between Putin and a number of other members of the Russian establishment demonstrates that there is a support relationship there. But that isn't enough. It is only when Night Wolves motorcycle gang engages in a active support to warfare that we see this dynamic of proxy warfare emerge, as it did in Crimea in 2014. The literature on this space is shown behind me in a number of key books I'd recommend for those who are keen on this type of topic. The distillation of this wisdom in these books is that proxy warfare is effectively best waged as coercive policy. It isn't just enough to give out money to all comers. Patrons do leverage their interests that often diverge to those of a client. Proxies require resources. They need the means of waging warfare. They need money, they need weapons, they need safe houses, they need logistic supply routes, they need medical support, and this has to come from somewhere. Often, this manifests in the development of shadow governance, where those resources are being drawn from out of the local population. Again, something that we should recognise and learn from our experience in counterinsurgency environments over recent years. And finally, when all of these variables start to exist, there needs to be a motivation. There needs to be a reason why an irregular actor is fighting in order to pursue their aims. I promised that I'd talk about how this is an increasing frequency of irregular conflicts. The light blue, rapidly increasing graph behind me is from the Uppsala Conflict Data Program, the UCDP, which is a fairly comprehensive data set talking about the nature of conflict. What we see in this graph is a decreasing proclivity for state-on-state warfare and an increasing proclivity for states to act through non-state actors in the pursuit of their strategic objectives. I also promised that I'd talk a little bit about irregular warfare theory. I've talked about this elsewhere in my time in uniform at Army headquarters and also in other forums. I'll be very brief with you today. What you see behind you is a very succinct overview of how a vast literature can be distilled down into effectively 3 variables: relative deprivation, organisation and competitive control. Where those 3 variables come together, we see the emergence of what people have metaphorically called wildfires of conflict, where these conflict environments break out and gain a certain life of their own. Others have talked about this. Douglas Pike talked about the experience in the Indochina Wars, where the phenomenon of people's war, what we saw communist powers employing, was this confluence between mobilisation, motivation and organisation. And so there's again history and depth from the literature that we can draw out here today. Moving forward, for those again who are looking for resources to understand this space, all of what you saw in the last slide is a distillation of material that's come out of the books that you see in front of you on the graphic in front. Suffice to say, however, that what's important in going forward is that we need this baseline understanding. From a baseline understanding of what irregular warfare is, we can then extrapolate out how states go about exploiting those non-state actors. And this is nothing new. In the Cold War era, Khrushchev and Kennedy, after their experience of brinksmanship during the Cuban Missile Crisis, had a very real reason for putting constraints on what they would allow their respective militaries to do in the way in which they would compete. This created what was called the stability-instability paradox. At the first pass level, mutually assured destruction created stability. There were strong disincentives for states to engage in state-on-state warfare. However, it created an instability because states would continue to look to exploit the seams. They would move to the peripheries in order to try to generate influence, and in so doing use that influence to undermine their adversary. Case in point, very soon after President Kennedy came into office in 1961, he started his support program to mentoring through South Vietnamese of Hmong tribesmen in particular, both in South Vietnam and also in Laos. This created a proxy conflict in Laos. This was no sideshow. The Hmong tribal army grew to a maximum size of 30,000 armed combatants, all fighting North Vietnamese divisions and at some points engaging in divisional level conflict. As a result, Laos became the most bombed country on the planet through the US use of air power in order to support their proxy. Likewise, Soviet Union did the same. They supported proxies in Angola, in Yemen, in Ethiopia, and of course, as we all recognise, they also supported proxies in Afghanistan that manifest eventually in direct Russian intervention. Ironically then, providing the opportunity for the United States to use proxy warfare to compete against the Soviet Union. And this is happening today. This snapshot is of the situation in the Middle East circa 2017 in terms of the messy network of relationships where states were supporting non-state actors, all to compete in pursuit of their broader national interests. Multiple competitions were occurring. At a major power level, the United States and Russia were competing for influence in the Middle East. However, at a middle power level, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and to a degree, other nations were competing for influence in the Middle East as well. Finally, this competition wasn't just limited to state-based actors. Islamic State created effectively a franchise model in which it would create these regional elements that it would leverage to be able to pursue its broader overall strategic aims. Okay, so that's bookended our framework. We've got the context of the Cold War era, stability-instability paradox, and we've got today. What you see in front of you on the left-hand side is a graphic depiction of the UCDP dataset of the number of proxy support cases, starting at the top of the graphic with South America, running through North America, Europe, Africa, Middle East, Southeast Asia. The point of this graphic, running from roughly 1976 through to roughly 2008, is that there are 10,000 cases of proxy support relationships. Every black dot is a relationship in which weapons, money, training were being provided to a non-state actor. This happens all the time, and yet it is an understudied area within military policy and training. Hence the purpose of my PhD research. But let's take this data set. What does it tell us? Well, in the table to the right, I break this out into 3 different time scales, starting from the top down to the bottom, where I'm looking at the Cold War era period, the post-Cold War era, the after the fall of the Berlin Wall, through to what I'm calling a new Cold War era, roughly 2005 through to the present day. What I'm showing by breaking up into these respective timescales is that the way in which states compete depends upon their strategic context. For example, during the Cold War, roughly 41% of cases involved the provision of weapons support. However, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, this percentage dropped to 25%. States were a lot less willing to provide that type of tangible evidence of their support to a non-state actor. Instead, what we started to see in a difference of environment here is an aspect of increasing willingness to provide financial support and other types of deniable support. As a result, these different timescales give us further insight into what's going on here. They give us an ability to look at what we might describe as a playbook of options available to a state. This method is emulating that of NATO Strategic Communications Centre for Excellence, their report shown in the top left of the graphic. This playbook approach, where we characterise the increasing commitment, i.e. risk or interests that a state is willing to pursue across a broad range of potential engagement functions based around the nature of the principal-agent relationship, their increasing perception of commitment, gives us an ability to inform policymakers as to the nature of what militaries can provide. For example, on the left-hand side of this playbook is the option of channel, where we talk about mobilising foreign fighter movements to support a client state. This occurred in the Spanish Civil War of 1936 through to 39, and again is what we're seeing in the way in which foreign fighters are being mobilised on both sides of the Russo-Ukraine conflict. Therefore, these plays, if you will, are timeless. They're characteristic that allows us to understand the nature of the type of support being provided. So, let me explain this in context. Iranian support to Lebanese Hezbollah over time is mapped with this particular graphic. The nature of objectives that are being pursued by Hezbollah can be intimated from the use of violence, and that's what you see in the background graphic, where blue represents the number of casualties that were inflicted through terrorism, violence against civilians, as recorded in the data set, as opposed to orange, which is violence that's pursued against armed state actors, police or military forces, in what we would come to colloquially know as guerrilla warfare. The purpose of this graphic over time, from 1983 when Iran started their relationship with Hezbollah, is we can see that the nature of plays that were being employed actually changes over time depending upon the nature of what Iran wanted from its proxy in the form of Hezbollah, and also in terms of the maturity of that actor to be able to absorb that support and be able to use that support to pursue its strategic aims. Here, what it looks like is the following of traditional Maoist guerrilla warfare theory, where in the early stages, support is deniable, it's covert, it's limited in scale. It's about organising a form of collective armed group and their ability to resist. In the second phase, we see a transition to the employment of assassinations, bombings, employment of IEDs, that type of guerrilla activity. Finally, phase 3 Maoist war is when you start to see formations being employed in an almost state-on-state type manner. Compare and contrast. In the 1980s, India supported Tamil nationalism. There are a number of armed groups that conformed with this. One of these was the LTTE, what colloquially became known as Tamil Tigers. If we characterise a period of initial Indian support, the roughly 1983 through to 1989 period, 1987 period, prior to the Indian peacekeeping force intervention, what we can see is a all-service support. Basically, all types of proxy plays were being employed by the Indians to support their respective proxies. Importantly, they didn't back a single horse. They backed actually a number of horses, roughly 6 to 8 groups being strongly developed over this early time. Of course, the Indian peacekeeping intervention, for those who are familiar with this history, is an example of blowback, where the LTTE effectively rebelled against their patron, and of course the conflict gained a life of its own, as shown by the terrorist incidents that you see in the graph behind. All right, so if we pull all of this together, we can understand a certain strategic logic. In our familiar ends, ways, means construct, depending on the level of fear, honour or interest that a patron state's mobilised, depends on their willingness to then engage a certain level of plays, their means to be able to pursue proxy irregular war. What complicates this picture is that unfortunately states aren't the only ones that have interests. Diasporas come into play and as a result complicate the way in which certain strategic aims are then being pursued. So how does this theory apply in the case of the current conflict in Russia-Ukraine? So what we have is an aspect of both state-on-state and non-state actors. This is a hybrid conflict going on. When we're talking about the way in which irregulars are being mobilised, what I show in the centre of this graphic is a very simplified assessment as to who's doing well on our 3 variables of relative deprivation, organisation and competitive control. What I'm trying to show is that the Ukrainians have been very, very good at their ability to tap into localised relative deprivation. The Russians, not so good. Their narrative of a Novorossiya that is engaging with Russian speakers and trying to revive a sense of imperialism isn't resonating. That's limiting the ability for an irregular conflict to really take off. There's a roughly even balance between the way in which militias are being organised on both sides of the conflict. Autocratic nations are generally very good at their ability to control a local population. The Russians are no exception in this regard. And that, of course, is then creating the tragedies that we're seeing in the news feeds of events like Bucha that are providing a strong disincentive for individuals to engage in irregular conflict. The bullet points you see on either side are some of these key milestones that we've seen over time. For those of you who aren't familiar with the RUSI reports, looking at the way in which Russia firstly organised subversively over the period November 2021 through to February 2022, I'd strongly recommend that you look at those resources. Again, Russia returned to its standard playbook. It looked to that playbook of proxy warfare. It organised subversive organisations that it aimed and intended to mobilise in the final week of February in conjunction with its conventional invasion. What you see on the right-hand side is the Ukrainians also using a subset of irregular warfare, the idea of resistance. Now, this idea has been out of the conventional lexicon for quite a while. It was a thing during World War II. We're familiar with the idea of French resistance, Belgian resistance, Italian resistance. Likewise, on the Soviet side, partisans that were operating behind enemy lines. However, that lexicon, that knowledge, is perhaps something that's missing today. Not for the Ukrainians, however. That screenshot that you see in the bottom of this slide is from their website, the National Resistance Centre, that offers, through a simple web connection, an ability for everyday individuals to get advice as to how they can actively participate in resistance against the Russian invader. This is something that we haven't seen in a while. My final slides are going to be a whole heap of different screenshots that are intended to talk about this democratisation of conflict. And what I mean by that is the way in which everyone, literally everyone, can participate in the collection of intelligence and supporting that intelligence being channeled in a useful direction to support armed forces or militias engaging in violence. The one I love in the centre of this imagery is of where are my earpods, that, whether it's true, whether it's not, is still fascinating in terms of its ability to engage everyday tools that can have an intelligence value to the right person in the right context and with the right targeting chain. What we also see is this manifestation of foreign fighters again, the dynamic of people self-mobilising and travelling to these conflict zones. Examples here are from left to right, including ex-US servicemen. We've got volunteers from nations as disparate as Sweden, Afghanistan, India, that are mobilising and supporting the Ukrainian cause. This is part of the democratisation of conflict. As we have this aspect of freely available intelligence that's coming out in social media on a daily basis, people can be informed. They, as a result, may choose to be mobilised to these types of conflicts in a far more responsive manner. This is not anything new. In the Spanish Civil War of 1930, 66 Australians travelled to fight in the conflict on both sides, the fascist side and the communist side. So it's nothing new, but it's faster today. It's happening at a digital speed of action. Finally, what we're also seeing is you don't necessarily have to travel to the point of action to be able to generate an effect. Ukraine's volunteer IT army, the cyber army that's mobilised to support Ukrainian interests, likewise can be aligned to Bellingcat, to Anonymous, and other groups that are fighting in pursuit of truth. Finally, this manifests in terms of the way in which we conduct international relations. Are we in a new period of Cold War hostilities between major powers, where this low barrier to entry through democratised means of engaging in conflict will encourage this type of proxy warfare to occur? Further, how do we also see companies, multinational companies, being engaged in supporting one or other side of the conflict at the speed of Twitter? This is, again, a dynamic that is democratising and taking away from our traditional state-on-state view of the way in which we engage in conflict. So, to my mind, this is a back to the future of the moment. This is where we engage with this type of literature from the World War II era. What are the lessons that resistance literature can inform us on in the way in which irregular actors can be mobilised for conflict, and the way in which they can be of interest and support to a nation's military. The graphic on the right showing that the French resistance was useful in helping to control territory after liberation. As the Germans withdrew, there's a governance void, there's a vacuum, and like anything else, nature abhors a vacuum. It needs to be filled by the reassertion of control, the reassertion of policing, and resistance organisations can help in that regard. They can help also with guides that are provided to conventional force elements, interpreters, guerrilla forces that operate in depth or to flanks that can help maintain a speed of movement for conventional forces. And so, ladies and gentlemen, that summarises the themes that I wanted to introduce you to today. My aim, as I started at the outset, was to talk about how I see this as being intimating new trends in conflict, ways in which we can grapple with what we are seeing as it manifests in the Russia-Ukraine conflict today. What you see in front of you are screenshots from some of my other writings on the topic. I recently put out a post with the Land Power Forum talking about some of these manifestations of Ukrainian resistance and why it matters, but also in the screenshot to the bottom right, aspects of the theory that sits behind why I'm presenting the logic that I presented to you today. And I hope that they're useful resources for you going forward. At that, I'll turn back to you, Mick, for coordinating our questions. Thank you.
And we do have one question from Major Jeremy Barrack from Headquarters, 2nd Division. And he asks, is the resistance operating concept a European-only model, or is it limited by culture and geography, or do you think that this could be applicable in our region? If so, how and what could be appropriate?
Yeah, and thank you, Jeremy, for that, because I did intend to talk to that a little bit more. The resistance operating concept is a publication that came out roughly 3 or 4 years ago. It was the result of Baltic, Polish, Scandinavian and Ukrainian states, and the way in which they gained an acute sense of threat from the way in which Russia was able to seize Crimea and the way in which they set up the simmering conflict in the Donbass. A number of conferences were held, a number of people came together. They drew out these lessons from the World War II era. The Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, have a rich history in this regard throughout World War II. The phenomenon of the Forest Brothers, a local insurgency that firstly fought the Soviets in their invasion after 1940. They then resisted the German occupation, and some supported the German occupation during Op Barbarossa. They then resisted the Russians again in 1943, all the way up to roughly 1957, roughly a decade into the Cold War. The resistance operating concept brought together all of these sorts of lessons from out of the national narratives of the way in which they resisted invasion throughout World War II, and the way in which they carried those lessons over into the Cold War era. It was developed in conjunction with NATO. NATO provided an overall support aspect, a marshalling of resources, if you will, to the development of all of those lessons being distilled into an operating concept that can guide our way today. So to finally answer Jeremy's question, this doctrine is freely available. You can Google it, you'll find it in a number of different places, one of which is the JSOW website. And it provides a model for how a small state might choose to resist a much stronger competitor. The Singaporeans have adopted this idea over time. They call it the poison shrimp metaphor. The Swiss had this model throughout pretty much the entire Cold War era. Today, it manifests in the total defence strategies of Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, Finland, Sweden, Ukraine, and is being adopted to a certain extent by Poland as well.
Okay. Well, we do have another question in from the audience. In consideration of the situation in Ukraine, and perhaps also to broaden things, the anti-Tatmadaw movement in Myanmar, two very different situations. What examples from history do you regard as the most instructive with relation to these two scenarios?
Yeah, so good question. There's an aspect to that where, again, history repeats. We can we can dive back into our history books to inform the way that we're grappling with these problems today. Interestingly, from a Burma, Myanmar context, when we talk about that conflict in World War II, we talk about SLIM and we talk about the coordinated withdrawal ahead of the Japanese advance and then the counter-offensive over the 44-45 period. And that seems to be as far as our histories, when we're talking about these sorts of topics, generally go. But the Japanese, like most other nations in fact, over this period, used proxies to support their efforts. In this case, the Burmese Independence Army that was developing to resist the colonial imposition of power from the UK. And that wasn't a new movement. They started to cultivate that movement roughly 1938. They started to exfiltrate the cadres, Aung San, who would go on to become the national leader of Burma after World War II, 1945 era, who of course was the father of Aung San Suu Kyi. And so these nationalist leaders were trained by the Japanese in the means of organising an underground, of delivering guerrilla warfare training. As a result, they then coordinated over a 2-year period in supported by Japanese intelligence, and the Burmese Independence Army provided that support to the Japanese invasion. Another interesting aspect of that history is that they weren't alone. During the invasion of Malaya in 1941, Japanese propaganda sought to sow division, to weaken the Allied armies. And so they appealed to the Indian components of the Allies with a nationalist narrative. In so doing, by the time they secured Singapore 3 months later, they had a 45,000-man Indian nationalist army that would accompany them in the Japanese advance through Burma, 1942. This isn't anything new. It's not geographically isolated. This isn't a European thing. This isn't a English-speaking or Russian-speaking thing. And so we can assume similar dynamics when we're looking at the problems that are occurring in Myanmar today. I.e. that regional powers are very likely to see it being in their own interests to try to see factional leaders that are similarly aligned, and we might expect finances, perhaps even weapons support, being provided to one or more of these standing ethnic armed groups in order to support those aims.
So we have another question from an unidentified member in the audience, Andy. He says, thanks, Andy, great talk. You mentioned Back to the Future. The world seems to be dividing into East and West again, as it did during the Cold War. And how do you think our army can better prepare for this new or old world order?
So firstly, I'd characterise it as autocratic versus democratic, rather than an East versus West. East versus West, to me, carries an overtone of ethnic or linguistic divides, and that's not the case. So in that context, I think the first step is what I'm doing now, trying to illuminate the challenge, trying to help us with the development of policy. If you go to the Defence Strategic Update 2020, look at grey zone. For memory, I think it's used about 11 different times with no good definition of what is actually meant by grey zone. That, to me, represents where the academic community hasn't been as good as it should be in educating and informing the policymakers that are writing those types of documents, of helping them with understanding, hey, there might be a proxy dynamic occurring over here. this is what that looks like. There might be a information or propagandistic narrative that's occurring over here. And again, history helps us in that regard. 3 years ago, Chief of Defence Force got up and said, we are facing a threat of political warfare. How did we respond? Well, not many people went back to starting to look at the political warfare executive that existed in Britain in World War II, who used the language of political warfare equals subversion and propaganda that's intended to weaken our adversaries long before the troops arrive on Utah or the beaches of southern France. The point being that we can gain this type of tangible insight into what we mean with the policy and language we use today by going back to the future with regards to the examples that we look to inform the dilemmas that we're faced with today.
All right, well, thanks so much, Andy, for your presentation. That was great. I really enjoyed that personally, and I hope you did too, all our viewers at home. Don't forget to follow the Cove either through the app, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, or the Forcenet platform to keep across the latest PME content relevant to Army and future Cove talks. So thanks again for joining us today at the Cove.